we capture this.
Fantastic. So can everybody see that screen? Awesome.
Yes.
Tēnā koutou kuia hui hui mai nei, ko tararua te maunga, te uru nei tau nākau, ko Manawatu te awa e mahia nei aku maharahara, e tipu aka au ki te papa ioia, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehe o Ōtipoti e noho nei au, ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei. Ko Craig Cliff toku ingoa, he kai whakahaere hōtaka hua waro kore ahau, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. So just in that little introduction there, I mentioned that the maunga that speaks to my heart are the Tararua Ranges, which you can see there in two of those photos with the wonderful wind farms on them. And the river that speaks to my heart is the Manawatu River. So that picture down at the bottom left there is reasonably new footbridge, Te Ara Kotahi, which goes allows some access to, sort of towards Massey University. But that spot, when I visited, I realized that was a spot I used to go when I was a kid. My dad's friend would take me spin fishing for brown trout in the river that within 10 years was declared one of the most polluted rivers in New Zealand, if not the world. So that's some of my my whakapapa and my tūranga waiwai and my connections to sustainability. The shot on the right-hand side is actually from my mother's backyard, looking over towards the ranges and the wind farms, but you can also see the Massey Aviation School there and the Palmerston North Airport. So it's interesting, those collisions of different energy sources and some sort of pluses and minuses when you think about the challenge of net zero right on my back doorstep. So what I want to do today is talk to you about the university's position in this global picture. So I'll start at that global level. So it was only last week. It seems like there's been a few other announcements since then, but the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group number 3 released their most recent report last week. So I'll just talk briefly about that as a way of situating this work within a broader global context. It was interesting to see some of the ways that the media distilled that most recent report, and some of them taking the view that the goal of 1.5 degrees is basically hopeless now and it seems out of reach. You can take a more positive view and look for some of the signs of progress between this report and the previous reports. But one of the big takeaways is that greenhouse gas emissions globally have slowed, but we're still growing up to 2019. Obviously, something rather big globally happened in 2020 with a pandemic. And the other takeaway I take from this graph is just the level of confidence they have over carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and industry. That blue line down the bottom with not much of a shading around it, but then the less confidence we have in some of these other gases. And it's really important to not forget about these other gases as well, and not forget about that there are unknowns or there's uncertainty in this. So I thought that was quite instructive, and sometimes if we get tangled up in arguing about the exact right number or the exact right method, actually we know generally where we need to go and what we need to do. The next takeaway, if you're looking for bright spots, was the decrease in cost of a lot of renewable energy sources and batteries for electric vehicles has come down over the last 20 years, and that's corresponded, particularly in the last 10 years, with an increase in usage. And then as we take that and look at the scenarios that the IPCC working group has modelled, which is on the next slide, the 2014 report had scenarios that went all the way up to 8 degrees of warming at the end of the century. The most extreme scenario here only goes up sort of a range of between 4 and 5 degrees of warming at the end of the century. Now that's still catastrophic. I'm not going to say anything that it's not a great thing to try and avoid getting to 4 or 5 degrees of warming. But it's interesting, once we're starting to bake in some of these technological changes and some of these behavioural changes that have taken place over the last 10 or so years are factoring into the scenarios. So we can see in that period of time, we can kind of eliminate a few of the worst case scenarios. So we need to keep working really, really hard at all levels, sort of globally, nationally, within our institutions, within our teams, and as individuals and households, to do everything we can to kind of make the lowest warming scenarios the most plausible and the most possible. Because when it comes down to it, you know, we'll be familiar with the sorts of impacts from a warming climate. The image on the left there is from the Ministry for the Environment's National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which was published last year. I won't go too much into the sorts of details because we'll be familiar with those, but I've cherry picked some examples on the right there from a wider table from the World Resources Institute, which is basically showing some of the impacts between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming, because we can sometimes, they can just seem like numbers and it doesn't seem like a very big difference, half a degree of warming. But when you think about this, 2.6 times more people would be exposed to extreme heat events with just that extra half a degree of warming, 10 times more years with no sea ice in the Arctic, 2 times as much species loss in terms of plants, and 2 times as bigger impact in the fish, decline in fisheries. So those have real big impacts in and of themselves, and then flow on impacts to thinking about economies and well-being of people. So boiling that down, we should fight to avoid every 0.01 degree of warming that we can, because that will just make this planet more habitable and enable a more equitable and just society. So thinking about the university, as Michael mentioned, I started in this role February last year. I gave a talk at one of these OERC seminars. I think it was in June last year. If you were there, you might remember me as the one where the laptop battery died and we had a bit of a glitch. That's the most memorable thing for me from that event, definitely. At that stage, we had completed our 2019 greenhouse gas inventory, and that was up online, and we were working to complete our 2020 inventory. I was also working to kind of pull together a lot of the foundational work to support running a program to not just measure the emissions, that's kind of getting to the starting blocks, but actually do the mahi to reduce our emissions and offset those hard to abate emissions so we can hit net zero by the end of the decade, but also be positioned to improve upon that in the years after 2030. So what I'll do today is I'll just run through a little bit about what the numbers are showing us from 2019, 2020 through to the work we're doing on 2021 now, some of the lessons that we've learned, and then talk a little bit about what that means in terms of a program to reduce emissions. I just want to plug here a document that went online last Thursday, which is our net carbon zero journey to 2030. And that is I'm really excited that now that's online, it's designed in a way that it can give staff, students, members of the community, and other universities, other parts of government that are part of the government carbon neutral program, just a window into what we're doing in our approaches. So I've just sort of captured 3 pages. There's obviously the cover, but the principles is really important to make sure that we don't get sort of carbon tunnel vision and net zero tunnel vision and end up hitting that target, but to the detriment of some of our other worthy objectives. So thinking about why are we doing this, it starts with the principle of orangatanga, health and well-being, and not separating out the health and well-being of the natural world and the human world, but actually recognizing that those are intertwined, and in many ways a large part of why we're in this mess is that separation, and that we haven't adequately considered the impact of human activities on the climate and on the natural world. So thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it's really, really important, and that helps us to decide the sorts of actions we take to reduce emissions and the timing of those actions. And so we've got that voyage overview there, in one of the later slides, I'll sort of give you the plan on a page of how we move through our short-term, medium-term 2030 targets and then 2030 and beyond. So yeah, I encourage anybody to seek out that document if they're interested in learning more about the program. So for the 2020 greenhouse gas inventory, so this is the second time we went through the processes of the university of having a really comprehensive inventory prepared in line with the ISO 1464 and the greenhouse gas protocol. And that basically challenged us to step beyond what we had been reporting in terms of greenhouse gases. So for those of you familiar with the terminology around scope 1, 2, and 3, so scope 1's the stuff we burn ourselves, scope 2 is the stuff we pay someone else to burn to generate energy for us, and scope 3 is supply chain, so we're buying goods and services, but that's created some emissions from the producer's end. Previously, before 2019, we'd been reporting through our annual report and some other avenues, predominantly on scope 1 and 2. And in preparing the 2019 inventory, we expanded to scope 3, looking at things like business travel, the food purchases we make to be able to serve in our residential colleges and in our cafes on campus and those sorts of things. When we were doing that 2019 one, first time out of the gate, there's always challenges with data. We weren't able to get full access to data in a timely way to be able to include all of our campuses, emissions related to things like energy on those campuses, and we also didn't include student travel, so student commuting to campus and student air travel, recognising the fact that we have a lot of students who fly down to Dunedin in the case of the campus that I'm on, but also other campuses from their home address to begin the academic year and then fly home at the end of the year. We have some operational control as an organisation over where we place our campuses, how we deliver our teaching and those sorts of things. So the first step of understanding what we can do and how we can manage that is measuring that and being upfront and reporting on that. So those were two of the big challenges that we had that I kind of picked up first year in the job, and lifting our reporting was adding those aspects and getting all of the emissions from our campuses in Invercargill, Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland, and then the student travel aspects. What we saw when we did that for 2019, we increased the overall number of CO2 equivalents that we were sort of claiming responsibility for 2019. So the previous report was around 35,000 tonnes, but when we add in student air travel, which is the biggest chunk, student commuting, the other campuses, energy, and everything else, we move up just shy of 50,000 tonnes, 49,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So we've re-baselined 2019, and that's a handy baseline because of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic, and that changed the game for a lot of things. So that's the big tower that we don't want to ever get back to in terms of producing that much CO2 or being that responsible for that much greenhouse gases. What happened in 2019, and just in terms of what that original baseline looked like in terms of where those emissions were coming from, just using the sorts of 6 themes that we use for the program and that you'll see in the Journey to 2030 document. Energy was the biggest in 2019 at 32%, so about a third of our emissions were from heating and lighting and those sorts of things. Student travel and staff air travel were sort of neck and neck for second place, around a quarter each. Supply chain, and the vast majority of that is all food purchases. Then other transport, so all the land and marine transport, as well as staff commuting to campus, and then waste came in at 5% of as an emission source for 2019. So it's useful just to see kind of the split of where things were coming from. So what happened in 2020? We dropped by 18,675 tonnes, down to just over 30,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents. And you can see there that tower beside 2020 just showing where the reductions came from. So the biggest reduction was over 10,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent that we reduced our university funded air travel, and for all the university staff and attendance. You'll know that that's a reasonably hot topic at the moment because of some we're wanting to kick off the conversation again about air travel with the borders reopening and being really clear about what our targets are for that. And it's not saying that we need to keep it at the level that it's been the last 2 years, but equally we can't in good conscience go back to the level of emissions that we had before the pandemic, so in that 2019 level. So there was a big sudden dip, not a sustainable level of reduction in air travel, but that was the biggest change. The next biggest change was that reduction on the energy side with the district energy scheme that supplies a lot of our heat to the campus here in Dunedin. We worked with Pioneer Energy to convert the boiler that feeds us our heat from coal to biomass, and that had a massive impact of a 5,000 tonne drop. So any other year, if there hadn't been a pandemic, that would have been far and away the biggest impact. And then everything else was about 3,000 tonnes of reduction. And again, COVID would have been a big factor in a lot of that. So all of the other travel related aspects such as accommodation and rental cars, shuttles, those kinds of things would be impacted by that travel restrictions. But also it's a little hard with the data that we have. I think COVID might have masked some other reductions that we would have seen just because of the work that we have begun and the conversations that were started around 2019 and flowing through into 2020, having made this commitment to net zero and thinking about what it means. And I'll talk some more about what those sorts of initiatives, current and future, will look like in a second. But I just put a plug in again for another document that's on our website there. You can just Google Net Carbon Zero Otago and you get there, or you can follow that URL. But our 2020 greenhouse gas inventory is up online. It provides not just the numbers, but tries to be nice and transparent about the calculation methods there. For some of the ones like student air travel, where we make I have to make a lot of assumptions because we don't have exact data over who flew on what flight and what class and those kinds of things. We've done some sensitivity analysis as well. So if there's anybody out there who has particular interests in particular topics, I really encourage you to read the various sections that apply to you and sing out if you've got any comments or questions on the methods that we've used, and absolutely opportunities to improve that. I'd use the example of food emissions, where we worked closely with some academics in health sciences and public health within that division to think about how we could measure the emissions from the food in our residential colleges. And we ended up with relying on the 6.6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per day, which is the average Kiwi diet. And now we're working through how do we take, now we've been able to get ingredient level data on what we're ordering. So we've got the quantities of heads of lettuce that we've ordered, or boxes of noodles. And the next step is to match that with ingredient level emissions factors. And we're actually talking with some academics at the University of Auckland who have just compiled a reasonably up-to-date database. Some of the things we're missing at the moment that hopefully Auckland can help us close are a lot of those might be termed meat alternatives, things as we both from demand particularly from students to have meat-free meals, and also the top-down policy of having meat-free meals on Mondays in our residential colleges is seeing a lot more things like tofu and tempeh being used as the protein in those meals, but we don't have very good emissions data at the moment. So it's this process of a lot of interplay between researchers in this field and then I guess practitioners and running these calculations. So to me, that's one of the amazing things about doing this work within a university is the connections that we can make, and hopefully that people can see value in engaging with us as a program, and having an applied scenario to be able to engage with. 2021 has a similar story to 2020. We haven't finalised the calculations yet. We're actually in the market for the third party who will come in and verify our inventory at the moment. And depending on who we choose will determine the timeline for that. But hopefully, in the third quarter of the year, we'll have completed that whole process and we'll have our 2021 inventory up online. And then we've explicitly stated in our tender we want to get faster at doing this. So by this time next year, we'll be aiming to be having a verified inventory or be in that verification process. So we're don't have such a lag between the year finishing and then reporting on it, because I don't want to be in that position where we hit an iceberg and we only find out 18 months later. And being nice and open and transparent with all of you, staff and students and community members, is a big part of our principles about what we're trying to do here. But just briefly about 2021, so the pandemic obviously continued, and that suppressed our travel. Interestingly, perhaps our air travel was down even further in 2020, down from 9% from 2020 to 2021. Which makes sense when you think about it. We had another nationwide lockdown. Auckland was off limits for a big period of time, and there was some international travel, particularly January and February in 2020, because that was before we had border restrictions. So COVID has kind of kept the travel at bay. But as I mentioned, with those restrictions easing, we need to make sure there's measures in place to support individuals who are either the travellers or the approvers of the travel, but then teams and the institution as a whole to make sure that what is a limited resource, our travel budget, and what that looks like in terms of emissions, that's being put to best use, and thinking about things like equity and the points at which in a career that might be most valuable to travel, to establish networks, to find your collaborators, and those sorts of things. So I think it's a really interesting conversation, and it'll be an ongoing conversation. We've got some Zoom drop-in sessions for staff. First one of those is tomorrow at 12:30, and those sessions are the end of it as well. So we'll take a lot of learning and a lot of pieces of things to add to the to-do list from that engagement, and we'll keep working on that. For 2021's energy emissions, overall it looks static, pretty similar to the total number for 2020, but there was an increase in LPG usage with a new building coming on stream, which has kind of masked some of the reductions in other areas. We had the energy analytics software start to be used in the latter part of 2021, and that made some savings pretty quickly. There were quite a few low-hanging fruit that identified, but we should see those savings, a year's worth of those reductions in the 2022 inventory when we crunch those numbers. So there's some exciting stuff happening in the energy space. A lot of our focus now is on getting rid of the coal in Invercargill, which is the last coal on any of our campuses, and then working on reducing the use of fossil gas and getting as much of that out of the inventory over the remainder of the decade. Just on the calculations and what we have in scope, we learnt late last year, early this year, what the carbon neutral government program expects us to report on, and we're doing over 99% of what they need to within our reports. They've specified we need to report on working from home, which we're in the process of adding into the inventory, and it's less than 1% of our total emissions, even in the years where we've had lockdowns. So it's not material, but now it's mandatory that we report on that. So it'll be in there, and also freight. And then just continuous improvement. So I've talked about food emissions calculations. We're reviewing the travel survey so we can get not just accurate and timely data about how staff and students are commuting to campus, but aligning with what the City Council here in Dunedin and the Southern District Health Board, their surveys, because we now share a workplace travel coordinator, and that person, Hamish, is working across those three organisations. So the more commonality we have around our data and our processes, the easier it is for us to stop reinventing the wheel, do collaborative initiatives, and really make an impact across Dunedin, and hopefully support more active and sustainable travel. We're going to do a deep dive on student air travel. As I mentioned, there's some assumptions that we make. We want to just not just understand how students are traveling, but what we can do about it and how to support them to travel more sustainably, and in some cases present offsetting options for that. And finally, looking at buildings and embodied carbon and how we factor that into our inventory, which might be a multi-year piece of work. So seems to have frozen. It's coming up slowly. So as we take a look at what beyond 2022 looks like, we've got emissions reduction targets that we've set across those themes, and actually they break down further into category by category targets. And we're looking to get down to, in 2029, 22,000 tonnes of emissions. It's more meaningful if we look at the next slide and we look at what those category or theme-based emissions reductions look like. So we've got the line graphs there. So air travels tells a story. We've dropped for the pandemic, then we're coming up to a ceiling, but it's a new ceiling and it's less than half of what it used to be. The others, some of them, there's a sort of a period of consolidation while we get better data and we establish some of these tools to drive emissions reductions. And others like energy, we just keep cutting. We'll get rid of the last lump of coal and start phasing out the fossil gas and use much more lower emissions and renewable energy sources. So I think the important takeaway is our targets are across the board. These targets were sort of built a bit of ground up and a bit of top down in terms of, do we have the right mix of aspiration and achievability? And these have all been endorsed by the university senior leadership team and also the university council. So that was part of what took a little bit of time last year to obviously come up with the targets, but then to make sure that we've got that highest level support and endorsement, which we absolutely do. It's been really, really encouraging to have people like the new VC coming in and saying, I want to front this. So on the air travel, he was there fronting this to all the heads of department, and that's really, really great. So we've got that support from the top down within the institution, and now it's up to us and me to drive some of these reductions and meet these targets. Just really briefly on the other side of the net zero equation. So if we get down to 22,000 tonnes in 2019, that's the amount in the year 2030 that we'll need to offset to get to net zero. So what are we doing about that? Going back to our principles for the program, we best align with that when we're working with projects like native forest regeneration rather than exotic pine plantations and things like that. And even better when we're connecting to existing research and relationships that our researchers have formed. We're negotiating our first contract or our first project at the moment, and hopefully we'll be in a position later on this year to announce that. We're also connected to the research that a lot of other staff are engaged in the carbon space, looking at soil, wetlands, kelp, pasture, tussock and minerals, and maybe one or two others. which are all really interesting fields, and if there's any way that we can support that work or provide some context in which that is supported, you know, on all ears. And if and when that becomes a viable, it becomes like a viable carbon market that includes those, then the university might also be in a position to invest in that as well. Talked quite a bit already about connections, but it is a really important thing for me and for the program. So here's just two examples of work we did last year with students. So on the left is a poster that a group of marketing students prepared as one of their group projects, reflecting back the idea that whatever your field of study, you probably connect with climate change, and in particular might connect with the Net Carbon Zero program. So just raising awareness about that and thinking about the ways in which you can, particularly if you've got a passion for this, for climate action and climate justice, is there a way that you can connect your discipline to that? And if you can do that and you can help out the university and this program, then that's really amazing. On the right is an example of that, where I worked with a group of graduate diploma and IT students to develop I guess a proof of concept online dashboard, which reflects on something that many of you might have been thinking, looking at some of these graphs and our emissions reduction targets, which is saying, well, that's one view of the world. What happens if your base assumptions are different? What happens if we have another pandemic? What happens if the university doubles in size? So with these students, as it was a proof of concept, we got to introduce 3 sliders, so looking at student numbers, and that's sort of a proxy for the size of the university, and behavioural change. So if people change behaviours faster or slower than what we have assumed, what's the impact? And then an external impact of what happens to the percentage of renewables in the New Zealand electricity grid, and basically the pace of change for that to get to 100%. And if that's faster or slower, not only will that impact our electricity emissions, but that might also have flow-on effects into our land transport. So we might see faster decarbonisation of our vehicle fleet because it becomes even more attractive. We might see more uptake of that of those sorts of vehicles for business travel and for freight. So it was a really good process to work through that and to have that kind of tool that I can use as a conversation piece with others. So again, another pitch: if you've got work, or if you've got students that need to do group projects and you're looking for a real life authentic context, we've got lots of data, we've got lots of challenges, so sing out if you want to connect. My last couple of slides before we get into some questions. The carbon neutral government program, which I mentioned, you might be interested in kind of what they're asking government departments, agencies, tertiary institutions to do. One of the big things we have to do is not only report our emissions, but set emissions reduction targets, and those targets need to be in line with how that program has defined the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree target. So that's the blue line there in that graph. So if you're at that line or below that line in terms of your emissions reduction, then that is consistent with the way that the carbon neutral government program is interpreting at 1.5 degrees. The grey line is our targets. So you can see that we're below the blue line through to, our targets go out to 2032, and we'll keep pushing that boundary out. So that's kind of why the grey line and the blue line cross in the 2030s. But at least in this decade, there's a reasonable gap between the blue line and the grey line, which is encouraging. But one of the reasons I talked about those confidence intervals in the IPCC report is I think it's a good idea to have a little bit of breathing space. That blue line is only one interpretation of a pathway to keep to 1.5 degrees. I think it's good to show some ambition, to have a little bit of a margin for error. And if things do change and we have more headwinds than tailwinds, we've got a little bit of breathing room as well. But it was interesting to do that after the fact of our target setting exercise and then compare that with the carbon neutral government programs expectations as well. So this last image is just a sort of the visual of the sorts of things we're going to be doing in the near term, which is the bottom blue wavy bit, sort of the middle of the decade and then the end of the decade, and just emphasizing that we are looking beyond 2030 as well. So we're taking a wayfinding approach to this rather than, so our Journey to 2030 document, we started writing it and calling it a roadmap, and we realized that that wasn't the right metaphor for us. Not just the fact that road transport's a big source of emissions, but it's not as linear as all that. We need to be awake to the uncertainties that are out there, keep our destination always in the forefront of our mind, but read the signs, be open to new opportunities that arrive and be responsive to new challenges. So I think that that's really, really important. So you might see when you read through the Journey to 2030 document, it won't look like a business plan. We're not going to put dates on things that we think we might do in the year 2027, because that's a false sense of accuracy or certainty. We'd much rather be open and transparent about what we know at the moment and what we don't know and where we need to go. And it's that connection and that collaboration is going to be a really, really important part of that. So that's all I wanted to cover, and hopefully that's given you some food for thought. And now we can jump into some questions.
Thank you very much for that, Craig. Any questions? We've got some questions in the chat. And so, but maybe some of these people want to ask their questions in person. So first off the rank is Anurang. Are you there? So Anurang asked, oh, you are. Sorry, I couldn't see you. Do you want to ask your question? Oh, yeah, there you are.
Sure. So with the CNGP, Craig, you mentioned that there are a lot of inclusions that still need to be. I mean, most of it is included, like I said, 99% working from home and a couple other that will need to be included. Something that I noted with CNGP was inclusion of materials that have been used for, let's say, construction activities that need to be included as well. Right now, from what I see in the exclusions list, construction is there, and I do see that you've written that there's a plan to possibly add that in, and you're working with suppliers. So how does that look in this year's inventory, and what sort of is the plan to include that?
Thanks for that. It's a good question, and it's always good to have people reading our documents in detail and looking for gaps. I think, for 2021, the inventory that we're pulling together, and the embodied carbon from construction will still be out of scope. But as I said, through this year, we're working on what we can do. I think and this is something that I've had a few conversations at that sort of around the table with carbon neutral government program, like people within the Ministry for the Environment and other agencies, around how you report on something where currently the standards are all built around operational emissions, and then you bring in something like embodied carbon, you get a very sort of
a skewed scope,
a jagged line, and how and I'm keen to engage with people like in the business school around what other approaches there might be, like take a depreciation approach like we do for the costs of buildings, and then spreading that the loss in the value over the life of that building. Is there a way to be able to do that that's meaningful and not kind of hiding the impact? But like, so we build the new Te Rangi Hero College, which is really exciting and will be good. There's quite a bit of steel that's still exposed in the structure, and so there's an impact there. We want to get into a position where we can report on that. Whether that's in the scope of what we're offsetting or not will be an open question that we need to resolve as well. But what I will say is that we are asking these questions now of our suppliers, so the design teams, and the sustainability office has run a climate literacy workshop with our facilities managers, and we've got one booked in with campus development, who oversee those big building projects, so that hopefully we're asking this at all levels of our projects, from a reclad up to a brand new building. What's the embodied carbon impact, and what are the options, and what's the difference between steel or an engineered timber structure, so that we can make those right decisions, whether or not it's included in our inventory. So there's lots of open questions, and it's a really interesting space, and I'm keen that we're connected to what's happening more broadly.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. So I've got another question from Eric Schaff. Eric, do you want to ask that question?
Sure. Again, just looking at, we're considering a whole host of initiatives. We've got a whole host of options. And to me, it's critical in any of these how we're weighing them up against each other. And one of the key parameters that comes to mind is sort of cost per avoided ton of CO2 equivalent, and where we sit with that metric relative to what else is going on and what the other choices are.
That's a good question. What we have established now, we've got a decarbonisation fund. So it's $5.5 million over several years. That's not going to get us everywhere we need to go, but it recognises that if we just let things slide, we will do some things and we won't do others that will help us to decarbonise. And I use the example of, maybe I'll use two examples. The first one is around vehicle purchases. So our budgeting is still based on, I need to replace this vehicle, so what's the cost of the petrol version? So we went through all of the vehicle purchases that were forecast in this calendar year's budget, and have spoken to all of those teams to be able to look at whether they could consider an electric vehicle as the first choice or a hybrid as the second choice. And the barrier we identified in some of those places was the capital budget that they had, even though when you look at even just over a 5-year cost of ownership period, the lower running costs, particularly with the fuel prices as they are, things came out pretty even over that time, but that's the capital versus operating difference. And so what we have done for how we allocate funding in that decarbonisation fund is very much what you're talking about. Is one of those metrics is what's the cost versus how much CO2 will we avoid. We're at the early days of, I'd say we're still actively trying to populate the list of things to consider, because the fund is new, and cost versus emissions reduction is one of those criteria. We're also looking at the potential that this is connected to research, the potential that this can be something where, so back to that vehicle example, we don't expect to keep topping up departments' funding so that they can purchase EVs. We expect the future budgets to be set to incorporate those, so then the decarbonisation fund will move into other areas. So the challenge of decarbonising and a ton avoided per cost, it's only a marginal cost on top of doing what we were going to do anyway.
Well, but we've done a number of projects, for instance, the coal to biomass, that had a cost and that had a tons of CO2 removed. Have we even just run the raw numbers to see whether we're coming out at $25 or $2,500 a ton? And again, to me, this is critical in making intelligent overall resource decisions, not just I can get rid of another kilo of carbon if I spend $40,000.
Yeah, so all of that, so that investment to decarbonise our part of the district energy scheme obviously predates me, but I know there was a business case done, and the discipline that we have to go through is forecasting that, but we do need to go back and confirm what the actual cost was and what the actual emissions reduction impact is. Yeah, that's a big part of this.
Yeah, again, that to me is a necessary absolute in the feedback system. Otherwise, we'll never learn anything.
Okay, thanks for that. So I've got another question by Sherry. Sherry, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Okay,
Hi, Craig. I'm just wondering, because I was in another discussion panel last week, and many other universities are really curious how we deal with the student air travel issues, because I think for now we are estimating the data. So they are really curious how we are going to precisely calculate the carbon emission from students in the future. Do we have any plan on this? And how we are going to reduce their air travel? Is it only going to be like encouraging them to take the action, or is there anything the university plan to do? Thank you.
Sure, yeah, it's a good question. So we've worked with the university's Office of Strategy, Analytics and Reporting primarily to come up with an approach it's our first attempt, put it that way, and that we'll need to work on enhancing that. So we have the home addresses of our students and their campus of study, and we make some assumptions that if you live a certain distance away from that campus, then we'll say that you flew from, so say you live in Wellington and you're studying in Dunedin, then we'll have a return flight between Wellington and Dunedin, and we'll add that in. And for our international students, we've assumed that and this is partly reflecting the times that we're in, we've assumed a one-way trip rather than a return trip per annum because of the difficulties with the border, and we want to kind of test that. So we need to survey things. I've talked with this with OUSA, particularly with their both international student rep and postgrad student rep. So we're wanting to kind of do some more sort of direct data collection that maybe can test some of the assumptions that we're making. But I come back to the point, like if we haven't measured it, we don't know what the likely size of the challenge is. And we had this discussion and including this in our scope and in our targets with senior leadership teams and those kinds of people. I think this is one area where we're showing some ambition, but we've got lots of work to do. How we reduce that, we will have to do a business case. This is sort of Eric's question, like how much effort do we put into reducing this, and what's the downstream impact of this, and are we going to discourage international students to come here, and what are the impacts that would have on our other strategic imperatives. So maybe we err more on the side of supporting the offset of their travel, and what would that look like? So it's a little bit like the air travel project that we've had for running for a couple of years for university funded travel. We'll run a similar process for student air travel.
Okay, so thank you very much. And I'm conscious of the time, so I think I will bring this to a close now. So could you join me in thanking Craig for his presentation? I think it was, we really appreciate the transparency, I think that you've showed in doing these analyses, Craig. So thanks a lot. Yeah, and so please join us for our next seminar, and yeah, thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. That was excellent.
Yeah, it's really great.
Thank
Really
you.
great.